Next on Global Perspectives, we'll talk to a man who embodies three old adages: travel is broadening, write what you know, and call him as you see him.
I'm not an entertainment writer who says, Michael, because I don't really have much respect for many of those people. I mean, professional respect. Personally, they're great people.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to Global Perspectives. A bit of a change today. Our guest is James McBride, author of The Color of Water. He's also a musician and a composer and has lots of fascinating aspects of his internationally oriented life to share with us today. Welcome, Mr. McBride.
Delighted to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Why don't you start at the beginning? We all know you for The Color of Water, but you've written other books, and there are many aspects of your life that we don't know. Why don't you give us just a snippet of where you started, your international background?
Well, I suppose you could say I started in Poland because my mother was from Poland originally, and she came here, met my father, married him. Myself, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in a housing project called Red Hook, or near a housing project called Red Hook. My parents started a church there, which I'm still involved with today. I studied at Oberlin in the college and the Conservatory of Music, and I have a master's from Columbia University. And I worked as a journalist for 9 years. I started out at the Wilmington News Journal, then went to the Boston Globe, then I had a stint at People magazine, which was one of my less proud moments, but it was an interesting job. I covered Michael Jackson exclusively for that magazine. Then I went to then I was under contract to Rolling Stone for a year, and then I went to the Washington Post. And I was at the Post for a couple of years working for the style section, and I quit. And then I became a jazz musician full-time for 9 years. And during that time I wrote my first book, The Color of Water. So I did a lot of traveling during that time. And then after The Color of Water came out, I did even more traveling, And since that time, I've kind of shaped a life for myself as a person who uses stories to, kind of a professional storyteller, if you will. I've written screenplays and books, novels. I've written music for people like Grover Washington Jr., Anita Baker. I've written a couple of very highly unsuccessful musicals. I've done a lot of failing, but I kind of live a life that I've created for myself. I love music and I love to write, and so I do those things.
You mentioned Michael Jackson. My wife and I are big Michael Jackson fans. Tell us about the Victory Tour.
It was a highly disorganized piece of business, but it was phenomenal in terms of how he dealt with his music and with his presentation. He was very paranoid about the press, and so his family and I they didn't like me that much. And for good reason, because I really wasn't an entertainment reporter type. But eventually they came to at least respect me. And I grew to like the Jackson family, particularly Michael Jackson's mother. Of course, I've never spoken about it publicly, I suppose, other than here. I mean, because it's something that most people don't know. But I never believed any of those things that they said about him, about the child molestation. I never thought any of that was true. I saw, because I traveled with him for 6 months, that's about how long the tour lasted. And I was there for most of it. I was there for the rehearsals, and I saw him rehearse. I saw how he worked. I met him. He thanked me at one point, later on after he realized I wasn't interested in whether he had, whether the dog pooped on the rug or the stupid entertainment reporter stuff. And I would just say that he was a very classy fella, very talented, deeply talented. And and very meticulous in terms of how he dealt with his music and his entertainment presentation. And as a musician, because most people did not know I was a musician, I watched rather closely. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I felt then and now that he was a rather misunderstood man. And I thought his mother did a wonderful job with her kids. I had a lot of respect for Mrs. Jackson. But again, I'm not her spokesman, and I'm not an entertainment writer who says, Michael, because I don't really have much respect for many of those people. I mean, professional respect. Personally, they're great people.
Let's go back to your mother. When was the first time you visited Poland?
Oh, I've never visited
Oh, you
Poland.
haven't visited?
No, I've visited. I've been to Europe many times, but I've never been to Poland. I was in France this summer, and I speak French fairly fluently. And it's worth mentioning that when I was in college, I stayed with an old woman who was French, who was a member of the La Resistance in French, La Resistance, whatever, in France, in Normandy. She was when the Germans took over Normandy, they took over her house. So at school, at Oberlin, they were very judicious about where they put the black students, because some French people just didn't want black people. I mean, it doesn't mean all French people are racist, blah, blah, blah. So some of them just didn't know or want any black students. But this woman, her name was Madame Rouet, she would take any student, and she was fantastic. So the black students who had stayed with her the year before said to me, when you go to France, make sure you stay with Madame Rouet. And so I did, and she was fantastic. And I ended up playing with a jazz band in France, and I never went to school. I would sit in her living room and watch television and eat all morning. And she had a lot of great influence on my life, in the sense that my mother was white, of course, and Madame Rouet was white as well. But they had a very common theme in their lives, in that they basically did what they wanted to do. And at that delicate stage, I was 19 then. I was going to, what should I do? I was, should I, be a doctor? I'm studying music. I'm studying English. What, And Madame Rouet gave me some of the best advice she ever gave me. Was one of the great things she said to me. She said, in my life, I've always done what I've wanted to do, and I've never been sorry. And this is a woman who still had the pistol in her house that she used during the resistance. I mean, she was the real thing. Most of the people in France are like most people here in the United States. They remember history the way they want to remember it. So everybody was in the resistance. Nobody was with the Germans the Vichy government shipped 75,000 Jews to their deaths without even being asked. So somebody was involved. In America, it's the same way. All of us who were the civil rights movement, by God, March on Washington. There were 1 million people there. And all of them weren't black, but I suspect most of them were. But in any case, my point is that revisionist history is part of the world's problem. But Madame Rouet was actually someone who truly was in the resistance. And one of the reasons why we started to talk about it is because she saw black soldiers for the first time. And she saw how, in Normandy, how kind they were, and how dedicated, and she saw the division, the separation between the races in the American forces, and she was quite puzzled by that. And later on in life, I went to write my first novel and started reflecting about World War II and some of the things that Madame Rouet was talking about. I recall that one of my uncles had served in Europe during World War II, and that was the inspiration for my first novel. But my mother, going back to your initial question, was someone who really never gave race that much import, in the sense that she just, she was a white woman in a black community, but it really wasn't that big a deal. She was respected by most of her neighbors. There was always one or two knuckleheads who, might have had something to say, but they didn't say it to us. She was generally safe. She was mugged a couple of times, but so was Miss Burton next door, who was black. She was mugged too, I don't think she was targeted because she was white. She was targeted because we were poor, and poor people steal from each other, or criminals steal from the poor probably more than they steal from anyone else. But I think her perspective on issues like race and class helped me as a man and as a writer and as a person.
Tell us how you got into writing. Did you intend to be a writer in a journalistic sense or a writer of novels, and you ended up being both?
I just floated to what I liked. I never wanted to be a writer. I thought writers were boring. In fact, and still, I don't like to be around writers too much. They're boring. But, you know, anybody who talks about themselves too much, or, you know, their craft or what somebody else did and I liked it and I didn't like it, blah, blah, blah. I'd rather be around a bunch of carpenters or hillbillies or somebody. Tell me a dirty joke. That's really kind of, you know, nah, I mean, I don't live there, but my point is that I don't really want to be around people who talk about craft all the time. I was at Oberlin. I took one English course, and the professor, his name was Tom Taylor, noticed something in my work, and he said, "You know, you have a real touch here." And I mean, the story wasn't that good looking back. I mean, God bless him, he saw something. And so when I got ready to graduate, I started becoming more socially conscious in school, and thought that maybe I should become a journalist so I could write the story to tell the world about all the wrongs that went on. I was a naive young man. So I got into Columbia Journalism School straight away out of Oberlin. I wrote an essay about my life, I think. I had to provide a writing sample. And Columbia's a heavyweight school. So when I got there, I wasn't like at the top of my class. I wasn't even in the middle of my class. I would say I was not, maybe there were 80 students there, 100 students. I don't think I was one of the top 80, but I worked hard, you know, and I played in the salsa band to make money. So that was kind of a problem because I would play until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then at Columbia, especially on Mondays, you had like this big day where everyone would have to show up and a great speaker would come and talk, you know, Tom Wolfe and Mayor Koch and all these, you know. And the students were really smart, you know. And they had been the editor of the college paper. Some had been journalists already. But I made it through somehow. There was a fellow named Norman Isaacs who was a former editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, who was my main professor at the time. He was an old-fashioned man from Indiana. He'd never taken a driver's test because he was so old that when they gave it, you know, when he got his license, they just gave you the license. So he was what was called my reporting and writing professor. And he was pretty tough. He was a hard person to please. And I remember when the Pope came to Harlem, he sent me up to cover the Pope coming to Harlem. And he sent me up there 3 times. Like the 3rd time and the Pope came at 10 in the morning. You know, at 7 p.m. I'm still walking around Harlem trying to get quotes from people. But he helped me tremendously. And he was a real moral, ethical person. And so I got out of school and I became a journalist, and I just started writing, and I just did journalism and jazz for a while. I didn't really want to be a writer, but I followed my muse, I suppose.
And what is your favorite type of writing now?
I prefer fiction because there's just more creativity involved. My latest project, I just did a novel about John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame. And I'm working on a nonfiction book about James Brown. And I must say the book about John Brown is a lot more fun. The book about James Brown kind of dropped into my lap, and certain family members asked me to take it on. Initially I didn't want to do it, and then I did it. Then when I did it, I realized I was in pretty deep because his life was very complicated, and you know, you're walking over territory that has so many hacks have walked over before you. And I shouldn't use the term, but it's true. I mean, music writers, you know, the top 10% are great writers. The rest are just guys who, you know, men or women who have clipping. I'm not really that big on critics and people who write about art. Unless you're really good, you probably should write about something else. Because I live on the artist side, and I know how difficult the art is. So, and I've never critiqued another person's art or book, because I'm not qualified to say whether somebody's art is good or not. So, you know, in doing a lot of the research on the James Brown project, there's just an enormous amount of inaccuracy about the man's life. He was not an enigma. He was a person who really never learned to trust, and for good reason. And also, when you're talking about race in America, there's always there's so much puff and smoke, it's hard to figure out where reality ends and fantasy begins, or vice versa. So I prefer fiction. Fiction is more creative. It allows your dreams to come true, or it allows you to be disappointed in your dreams, but it gives you the creative plateau, creative palette to make really wonderful things happen, and to find the common ground where we all stand. And that's really the essence of my work.
And you also teach. Did you anticipate being a teacher?
Oh, no, not at all. I teach 1 day a week at NYU. I only teach 12 students. I don't teach honor students or grad students. I don't teach any of the stars. Whoever can get into the classes. It's a very intensive class. I love the kids. It's been a good experience for me at NYU in that regard. They came to me and asked me if I wanted to, teach. And I said, well, I'm not, I don't know. I mean, I'm doing okay. But I'm also in the Writers Guild, which, when you're a screenwriter in the Writers Guild, and you have to make a certain amount of money every year for their health insurance to work. And my daughter at the time had a heart condition and needed surgery. So I said, well, and NYU said, well, we'll give you health insurance too. And so I put it all together. I said, well, I'll try it for a year. And I ended up loving it, I really like working with young people. My dream is to, once I get my kids through college, is to move back to Red Hook and just work with the young people there.
Tell us some more about your international travel. You mentioned France. Are there other places you've been to that you really, really enjoyed?
Yeah, I've been to South Africa. I've been to Africa maybe 3 or 4 times, at least 4 times. I've been to South Africa at least 3 times. I went to Senegal to do a story for National Geographic about music. This was maybe in 2008, I think. I think Senegal is, if I had to predict, I think it's probably going to fall apart. Maybe it'll fall apart and then reconstruct itself again, but there's just too many poor people wandering around Dakar. I went to the Ivory Coast as a very young man. At a certain point, I quit the Boston Globe in 1982, I think it was, and I went to Africa. And I went to the Ivory Coast, and I played with a band there. I stayed there about 2 months, and that was a lot of fun. And that's when Bouffonnier was still president. Felix Bouffonnier was still alive, so there was a semblance of normalcy throughout the country. Great musicians. It was wonderful. I think all Americans should see Africa. I think Africa is much more interesting than Europe is. Not just because of my African American side, because I've never, as I stated earlier, I've never been to Poland. I taught English for Polish refugees, though, when I was writing The Color of Water. So I would, in fact, I still recall there was a woman in my class, and I am not kidding, she was a dead ringer for my mother. She had the same hair, the same face. She was taller, though. She was taller and slimmer. But in the face, she looked just like my mother. My mother Mom used to think that was very funny, because I'd say, Ma, there's a lady in my class that looks just like you. She thought that was just so, she thought that was so funny. And one of the things that I was really impressed with my Polish students was that this was after I left journalism and I was a full-time jazz musician. And I needed some extra cash. And I taught in Williamsburg, which was a pretty Polish section of Brooklyn, and a Catholic church, St. Stanislaus. These people would go to 2 jobs or 3 jobs a day, but at 8 o'clock on Monday and Wednesday, there they were. They had studied, they really wanted to learn English. They really worked hard. I respect people who work hard. I respect people who come here from Latin America. I am for immigrants, and you can put that down in my name with capital letters. This is a nation of immigrants. People come here to work. There's always room for them. Einstein was an immigrant. Christopher Columbus was an immigrant. So I don't waste time with that, that nonsense, that fear. These people, they were from Poland. They had extraordinarily difficult lives in New York City. And they worked like slaves, and they always came to class. And I did that for 3 or 4 years. It was inspiring me. It helped me, actually. Because I saw, no one has more, blondes don't have more fun, And everybody has difficulties. How you face those difficulties really is that's your choice. And then when I was in Africa, I was amazed at the kindness of West Africans in both Senegal and La Côte d'Ivoire, in the Ivory Coast. In South Africa, I met Nelson Mandela a couple times. I was there twice. I was there twice for that purpose. Once I went with Quincy Jones, and they were opening this thing called the Blue Train, which is like this luxury train, and Mia Farrow was there. You know, she was real nice. She's a really good person. And the second time I went because they wanted me to write a fuller autobiography of President Mandela. And this was not long ago, maybe 2009 maybe. Mm-hmm. So I went there, I spent maybe 2 or 3 weeks doing research before I actually saw him. And when I saw him, I went back to the hotel and packed my bags and went home, because I realized that he was too old to do it. And he'd been through too much. And he was just doing it to raise money for the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And I just couldn't bring myself to sit down with him and go over and force him to go through that stuff so that he could raise more money for his foundation. He was being kind of coerced, not coerced, but he was being nudged into it. So I burned a lot of time on that project, but it was fascinating also to see South Africa from that perspective, you know, as a writer going in to write about it. It's you know, South Africa is a lot like America, like the United States in many ways.
Tell us a little more about your mother and the influence she had in your life. She had an extraordinarily difficult life, especially early on, as you've written about.
Well, my mother was a pretty plain-spoken person. She was she was the daughter of an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. She lived in Suffolk, Virginia. And that was a place that was not friendly to Jewish people at all during the 1930s when she was living there. She met and married my father in 1941. She raised 12 kids and sent them all to college. My mother's twice widowed. She was twice widowed. My father died just before I was born, and my stepfather died when I was 14. She never asked people for anything. She was very proud. She worked all the time. She became a Christian. And she pretty much was a very religious woman throughout the course of my life knowing her. I think she did a very good job. But one of the things that she really understood was that you have to give people space to change. She understood change because she had changed so much herself, and she understood that change was possible and probable if you open your heart and if you're kind. And so I use that in my own life, in the sense that I think people need space to be able to say they made a mistake. People need space to change. And my mother didn't judge people that much. I mean, she did, though. I mean, she was judgmental like any mother. I mean, I would even say that she was probably a little bit racist. I mean, all of us are a little bit. But not too much. I mean, my mother didn't waste too much time with race. I mean, she was just interested in feeding her kids and living a good life and moving toward God's word. But I think if you poke any American deep enough, you'll find some kind of racism and prejudice. In fact, you'll find plenty of it. But my point is that she tried not to judge people. And so I tried to do that in my own life.
What do you do that is inspiring outside of writing? What is it? The environment? Is it art?
That inspires me, or inspiring?
That inspires you.
Jeez, that's the hardest question I've been asked in a long time. I'm inspired by seeing young people do what they do. I suppose teaching inspires me. I mean, it's the hardest job. You can do it you can do it as hard as you can. It's still not enough. And I really don't have time to teach. I mean, I teach on Fridays, but I have to spend Thursdays preparing for Friday, which means I only have 3 days to write and research, and maybe part of the 4th day. But it inspires me to see these young people get better and come into themselves. I'd like to teach high school someday, or at least work with teenagers. I really like teenagers. I respect them. So that inspires me. I don't know if that inspires other people, but it inspires me.
Good. Well, we appreciate that you spent time with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.